I think one of the problems in coming to grips with this, or even knowing what questions are better questions than others, if we're going to try to look at basics, and it's time to do that, is it's better to talk instead of terms like modernity and civil society and enlightenment, and that's what we have, and it's been wonderful. Well, obviously it hasn't been wonderful. All of those promises have not been delivered on. I mean, it's time to notice that. And so I think it's better to use a term like mass society or even mass production society. This is the technosphere. This is the technoculture, which means industrial society. And as Walter Benjamin pointed out, in terms of agency, for one thing, mass production is the production of masses. People become masses. And they don't become full of radical ideas. I mean, that was one of Marx's huge mistakes, to imagine that they do when they become massified, when they become industrial objects instead of they were more subjects before industrialism, before they became factory workers and all that, even though a lot of the left is still dreaming on that level for some reason in 2008. Anyway, and another thing about cities, I was recalling, I was in New York last year with Kevin Tucker, and I really recommend his writings if you see that or come get a chance to read any of his. He's the editor of Species Trader, for example. And we were at NYU, and there was a question that somebody raised: what does this primitivist thing have to offer cities? And unfortunately, it got written up later, but an account by somebody who's pretty hostile to primitivism said, I asked Kevin Tucker, what does this offer cities? And his response was nothing. And that's true, except he went on to explain why we don't think it's a good idea to try to prop up cities, to try to reproduce cities forever. They are artificial, they're untenable, there is no future for cities. That's what he was trying to flesh out, that's what he was trying to present. But it was just, in other words, this die-off thing, this calling for genocide thing, if you want to be dishonest about it, as this writer did, nothing, end of quote. As if, this misanthropic, who cares about people, let them all die, it'd be better if they all die. Well, that's not it at all. And Chomsky, for example, knows full well that's not what it's about. It's about trying to approach some kind of process or transition where people get some autonomy and life can be perhaps instituted on a basis that isn't taking us over the cliff. And in terms of practical things, globalization is another kind of case in point that we could think about. In other words, just a few years ago, there was a big, quote, anti-globalization movement. Seattle and, all the rest of it, Quebec City, Genoa, and so forth. And it kind of disappeared. And probably for a lot of reasons. 9/11, the big repressive thing that was opened up, handed to the state, if you will, was not a healthy impact on the radical questioning and radical movements, obviously. But things were already starting, some people noticed, it was already kind of slowing down. And I think maybe one reason was it was never anti-globalization. That's a misnomer. Almost nobody, with some exceptions, some of us, were literally anti-globalization. The rest was a common question at protest. The journalists would come up and stick the microphone in a protester's face and say, so why are you against globalization? Why are you anti-globalization out here in the streets and all this stuff? And they'd always say, I think, it was my impression, oh, we're not against globalization. We want a nice, warm and fuzzy, bottom-up, non-corporate globalization. But they still want globalization. How do you industrialize the world, which is what, among other things, globalization is, with its standardizing impetus, as Jesus Sepulveda writes about, and the rest of it, and just put some rhetoric on it and say, oh, we want another kind. Well, isn't it, what is it at base, though? Do you want it or don't you want it? I mean, you can cut through that and try to face that question. What kind of a world wouldn't be globalized? For example, a decentralized world, a world of the face-to-face. there's the word community, at least in the States, is everybody's favorite rhetorical pitch. Community, we want community, let's hear it for our community. Well, you could say there is no community. That's gone. There is no community. There are neighborhoods, but I don't know where the community is. And what happened to that? It's eaten up by mass society. It's a casualty. You know, I mean that's, I'm throwing that out. I mean, maybe that isn't totally true. I hope it isn't totally true, but you know, something like that. And you know, I was thinking of something so long ago, that happened so long ago, and it just popped back into my head, and it seems like, let me tell you a short story here, and you can see if I'm stretching it to make a point, but when I was in college, when I was a senior at Stanford, they offered some senior colloquia, and if you were lucky, you got this special treat of one of these courses that was more interesting probably than what you'd had for 4 years worth of stuff. And I happened to get into one taught by Alexander Kerensky, who was the head of the Russian government in 1917. When the Tsar fell, he was part of that March 1917 revolution until Lennon, until the big revolution, which of course the Bolsheviks got a hold of in October. I had no idea the guy was still alive. This was in the 60s. The guy was quite old, and the newsreel cameras were rolling every week at the seminar because, wow, this is Alexander Kerensky. I mean, gee, that was 50 years ago. What's the deal? So anyway, it was fascinating, and he would talk about Lennon, and he'd get all worked up as if it happened last week. It was quite amazing. You know, he would be, what an unprincipled guy. And anyway, on campus they showed the silent film, the Eisenstein film, 10 Days That Shook the World. And part of that, what the first part especially, is about him. And he's in the palace. This is the way Eisenstein depicted it. He's in the palace and the crowds are coming and they're starting to break down the door. And it shows Kerensky, the head of the provisional government, on this big staircase. And he's running up the stairs and then he's running down the stairs and he stops in this landing. And it was a perfect device because the problem that Kerensky had was he was not on the side of the Tsar and the big landholders and the church, for example, the classic right. He'd overthrown that. But the bigger, the other part of it were the great numbers of people who wanted peace. They wanted the end of World War I, they wanted land, and so forth. That was, of course, the real revolution lied there. But he was not a radical. He was just kind of a liberal in the middle. And he was squeezed, and he had no place to go, and he was gone. In fact, it's probably a wonder he got out of there with his life. But the reason I mention this is, it is possible to be caught in the middle, even in the context of, say, anarchists. You know, in other words, if you are sort of against globalization, but actually you are not against globalization, and you don't want to take on some of these mechanisms and basic institutions that seem to be at the bottom of creating this unprecedented crisis, then we may be just losing out if you don't want to go as far as is required. For example, industrialization. You know, there's no another little illustration I saw on public television a few years ago. There was a public forum, and the part that I'm recalling is Henry Kissinger was being critiqued, to put it mildly, by this guy who was just giving him this very heavy, very specific indictment of his evil, you know, he was, of course, the Dr. Strangelove of the 70s, you know, Nixon and the war and everything. And this critique, though, actually wasn't about the war. It was about U.S. foreign policy, of which he was the architect at the time, and its horrible impact on the environment, on smallholders in various places, especially in Southeast Asia, but not just that, and how awful, what a horrible thing it was for so many people, and how much blood he had on his hands, and on and on and on. And you're waiting. I know, I think, certainly myself, and I think pretty much everybody else was waiting, because the guy